Well, how do you create a permanent need for a massive military industrial complex? Well, of course, you create enemies who are not really enemies, but you tell the American people that they're enemies, and you create a war complex, a permanent war on terror, perhaps. When does it ever end? The answer is it doesn't, so you need this massive military industrial complex. Well, how do you create a permanent need for big pharma? Well, you create something similar, just like wars, of course. You create a permanent pandemic market like they're trying to do right now with bird flu and any other disease X they want to throw at you. Journalist Max Jones has just uncovered evidence that the WHO is creating a permanent pandemic marketplace. And he wrote a great piece on unlimitedhangout.com. I'll link it up in the description. I encourage all of you to read it. And journalist Max Jones joins us now. Max, great to have you here on the show.
Thanks for having me, Clayton. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. So you really pull back the curtain on this, saying the industry is pursuing the only solution, you write, that's left for their dying model, which is a full takeover of the World Health Organization to capture the global regulatory system. And I think we've been seeing all these pieces coming together, but you really dive deep in this piece. Explain to us what's happening.
Yeah, so basically, every X amount of years, it depends, based on the company and their patents. But big pharma faces these things called patent cliffs because they basically generate most of their profits on these things called blockbuster drugs. And the way that you get a blockbuster drug is by attaining patent exclusivity over it, right? So for X amount of years, no other drug makers can make that drug besides no other drug maker can make that drug besides the developer of it. Right. So basically, when that patent exclusivity ends, pharma companies face a crisis because, say there's a couple graphs in the piece that show how significant these products can be to the companies. But say, a drug is 10 to 30% of the profits that a company generates any given year. When that patent exclusivity ends, the company then faces what it's called a patent cliff. And it's called that because if you think of profits going up and up and up and up because of your patent exclusivity on a drug, the patent cliff is when that all falls down because now you have generic competitors who are selling the drug at a cheaper price. The drug is almost identical, so it can be interchanged usually in treatments. So if a doctor is prescribing you the non-generic version of a drug, they can, once the generic version comes out, they can say, hey, want to save some money? Use this one instead, right? So big pharma is facing a patent cliff right now. Lots of companies in the industry they're facing, I think it's close to $200 billion in losses. And that's kind of normal for pharma, right? But this time it's a bit different because they usually address patent cliffs through mergers and acquisitions. So they'll merge with another pharma company. Like I think in 2009, Pfizer acquired Wyeth, I believe it was called, this other really big pharma company. But the thing is that now, through years of industry consolidation, basically through years of big pharma eating itself to stave off the patent cliffs, they become, quote unquote, too big to fail. But now the system that they've become too big to fail within is not really possible for them to operate because they usually do these mergers and acquisitions to hopefully get a new blockbuster drug, right? So you acquire this other company and you hope that you get a new blockbuster drug that you can bring to market. The problem now is that typical chemical-based drugs, which are the drugs that have been used for most of medicine development, right? They're these kind of drugs that are general in the sense that they activate your entire immune system. Now there's been a shift to biotechnology because it's becoming harder to get blockbuster drugs with chemical-based drugs because of a couple reasons. One is there's tighter regulatory constrictions on these drugs. Two, a lot of diseases are already used for these chemical-based drugs, right? So there's kind of now the shift needs to be towards more untreatable things, right? So because one, the regulatory constrictions on chemical-based drugs are going up, and two, lots of chemical-based drugs already exist for these diseases, they're shifting to biotechnology, which unlike chemical-based drugs, these are very specific drugs. So rather than activate your entire immune system, you have something like mRNA, which targets a specific viral protein, and that in the example of mRNA, and then creates more of that protein to fend off the virus, right? The problem with biologics, though, or biotech, is that this specific intention of them makes them really dangerous. They're kind of unpredictable. So like in the case of the COVID vaccine, sometimes it creates too much of that spike protein, and then it leads to issues like myocarditis, for example.
Right.
Or like in issues of gene editing technology, which is another big market acquisition of pharma in recent years. It might, cut a gene that they don't want you to be there, but then it might activate a gene that's a cancer gene. So now you got cancer because you've done gene editing technology. And basically, they've switched their efforts to biotechnology, but because of the safety issues, it's really hard to succeed with biotechnology in the typical regulatory process. And Whitney Webb documented that really well in her piece called Moderna Hail Mary, I think it's called.
Right.
And long story short, Moderna had no products that had ever gone to market before the COVID-19 pandemic because they were mostly focused on biotechnology-based products, and they could not make it even to human clinical trials because of how dangerous they were and the side effects that they were producing.
Well, I was going to say one of the big pieces of what stunned me, and we've been harping on this for quite a while here on the show, is this idea of emergency use authorization for a lot of these drugs, right? That they don't even really go through typical trials, and they get this emergency use authorization, and they're then placed into the marketplace. So how does the emergency use of all of this come into play here? And then I want to talk about the World Health Organization piece of this and the sort of takeover there, but can you explain that part of it?
Yeah, so basically, in the context of biotech, right, or pandemic-related products, the emergency use listing or emergency use authorization. Emergency use authorization is the law in the U.S. Emergency use listing is the procedure by the World Health Organization. It basically grants drugs and drug companies this emergency use tag, which allows them to basically skip the clinical trials and the lengthy process of getting a drug approved in the typical regulatory process. And it's an accelerated way to get a drug to market, essentially, that involves massive deregulation. And the reason that the emergency use listing is so vital in the context of biotech and or pandemic related health products is, one, because in biotech's case, for example, like I mentioned before with Moderna, these drugs are really dangerous, so they can't really succeed in the typical regulatory process. They can't even make it to human clinical trials a lot of the time, and when they do, they produce serious adverse effects. So, now that Big Pharma has acquired all of these biotechnology companies to stave off the losses that they're going to receive from the coming patent cliff, right? They need a regulatory pathway to get there. And that regulatory pathway appears to be, like in the case of Moderna, massive deregulation, in this emergency deregulation that's, initiated under the guise of a pandemic, an emergency, which then allows these products to not go through those trials that usually that holds them back from getting to market, right?
Right.
And then in the context of a pandemic, there's basically one of the initiatives that the World Health Organization international regulations and the World Health Organization CA+ treaty has is employing constant research and development on pathogens with pandemic potential, right? So the idea is that you're already researching and developing medical countermeasures to all of these different viruses that you've surveilled through massive biosurveillance to develop medical countermeasures for them. And the thing is that once the pandemic that the WHO will declare without the approval of any institutional body, by the way, once the pandemic is declared, they need a countermeasure to it, right? So now, because there's an emergency in place, right, and apparently there's no other treatments for it, they need the emergency use listing, aka the deregulation that allows them to skip all the clinical trials, like we saw with the mRNA COVID vaccines and Operation Warp Speed.
Yeah, it sounds like one big sort of Ponzi scheme, or one big scheme altogether with the World Health Organization. I was led to believe that the World Health Organization is there to protect us, right? It's on our side. It sounds like it's totally been taken over by big pharma. It's not on our side at all. Am I wrong?
No, you're exactly right. Basically, the World Health Organization is funded through member state contributions, which are these regular sort of donations that you make if you're a member state to the World Health Organization, and private stakeholders, which are which are basically donations from, they can be government bodies or government institutions, private companies, NGOs.
Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is a big one.
Yeah.
And the thing is that 80% of the funding of the WHO comes from those private stakeholders. And that funding is, unlike the member state contributions, it'll be like, we're funding you to do this certain thing, right? So it comes with more strings attached, that funding. And you can see, if you look at the WHO's advisory boards and also their policies and their committees, that private sector influence has basically infested the organization with all of these ideologues that are pushing their own agendas. Like, just for example, on the Strategic Advisory Group of Experts on Immunization, the acronym is SAGE for the WHO. 13 of the 15 members, at least from what I found in my own research, currently are from Bill Gates funded NGOs or private stakeholder NGOs, usually funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, or coming directly from the Wellcome Trust, which is a whole other thing that we could get into.
How are they able to pull this off? I mean, we cover this here on the show. I know CNN and others don't really talk about this, but it seems like bird flu is like their next big plan. They have the big bird flu summit in October. They're going to talk. They have breakout sessions devoted to public outcry, civil unrest. So Disease X, Dr. Peter McCullough has been talking about bird flu as being perhaps the next big pandemic. But we're calling it out. We're seeing it. So how are they going to be able to pull this off? I mean, this seems to be they're holding on to power, grasping at straws in order to make profits. But we're calling it out. Are they going to be able to sustain this sort of permanent pandemic marketplace? Like, every few years, there's going to be a new bird flu. There's going to be a new COVID that we're all going to need to worry about and get these emergency drugs that the government's going to push. Can they pull this off?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure. I hope not. I have a feeling that it will be a lot harder, because I just know that there's a lot of people that I know personally that felt, myself included, right? Like during the COVID-19 pandemic, I remember when the vaccine came out, I was like, oh, finally we get to end the pandemic and I get to get this vaccine and the virus will stop spreading or whatever. There's a lot of people like me that realized that was all BS, basically, at the end of the day.
Right.
And I'm not sure if they'll be able to, but I think the thing is that we have to remember is that not every pandemic or public health emergency of international concern, as the World Health Organization refers to it often, will probably be on the same like media scale and panic scale as COVID. So there's still for example, the World Health Organization can kind of just declare a pandemic willy-nilly, the director general. He doesn't need approval of any institutional body. Earlier drafts of the international health regulations actually seek to expand the ways in which you could declare a pandemic of international concern, even though the World Health Organization director general, as of the 2005 international health regulations, can already just, say, hey, we're in a pandemic, and then that's it. But basically, what I'm saying is that even if, say the World Health Organization declares a pandemic for the bird flu, even if that's not getting the same media attention and people aren't, flooding Costco's and all these stores in panic like they were with COVID, they can still then, for example, give Moderna, who's developing a vaccine right now for this bird flu, and on an accelerated path. They basically, the World Health Organization could still give that Moderna emergency use listing and then give it its second product ever and bring it to market, even though maybe not as many people will be taking it as the COVID vaccine. They can still do that, right? So there's still this regulatory pathway for these drugs even if we're not all riled up like we were during COVID. And I imagine they will try to get us riled up like they did with COVID, at least at some point in the near future.
Yeah, no human trials. Sign me up. Yeah, I'll be your guinea pig for these experimental drugs. This is these biologics, these mRNA vaccines with these spike proteins. It's absolutely disturbing.
And just real quick, on that, like the Wellcome Trust, for example, whose former director was Jeremy Farrar, who is now the chief scientist of the World Health Organization. Whitney Webb documented this in her article on Welcome Leap. They actually are doing this thing to skip human clinical trials where they're trying to use synthetically created or farmed organs to test pandemic products. So like, let's grow an arm and then test the vaccine on the arm or whatever other organ. And then, oh, look, it's safe on this arm that we created. So now it can go straight to human clinical trials or maybe even skip human clinical trials in the face of a very severe emergency. So that just shows you how far this really goes, this process of deregulation and accelerated pandemic health product development.
Imagine being the janitor, not knowing what's happening in that facility, and you stumble in one night. You see a bunch of arms being grown so they can do clinical trials on fake human arms. Like, this is where we are right now. It's crazy. Thank you for your amazing journalism on this, Max. I encourage everyone to read this, and you can dive more deeply into all the details. You can see the graphs and all of the data that Max has here. Go to unlimitedhangout.com. We'll have it linked up in the description below as well. Max, keep up the great work. Thanks so much for joining us for the first time on Redacted.
Of course, Clayton, you too.